You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez, and with me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. Pete, there can not just be only one. In this case, there are two co-hosts. So, how's it going, Pete? How are you?
It's going great. I still my head is still attached to my shoulders as of right now. Who knows by the end of the podcast episode what will happen? But that's part of the excitement. So yeah, I'm doing well, and I'm excited to talk about our topic today with our guest, and can't wait to dive into it.
That's right. Speaking of our guest, we have on Michele Brittany. So, a little bit of a Cliff Notes version about Michele. She is a writer, an editor, a photographer, and pop scholar. Her interests lie in the worlds of horror, spy, and gothic genres. She's edited a few essay collections, including James Bond and Popular Culture, essays on the influence of the fictional super spy back in 2014, the Bram Stoker Award nominated Horror in Space, critical essays on the film subgenre from 2017. She is the co-host of the H.P. Lovecraft podcast with previous Fan2Fan podcast guest Nicholas Dyack. And you can find more about Michele on her blog and more about her work on her website, michellebrittany.com. Michele, welcome to Fan2Fan.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to meet you both, and I'm excited to talk about Highlander.
Yeah, if you can't tell from Michele's background, if you're seeing the video for this, we are talking about the 1986 movie Highlander, directed by Russell Mulcahy. Michele, why are we talking about Highlander?
Well, there's probably a couple of reasons. One, we just celebrated the 36th anniversary of the film, which originally premiered back in 1986. But the second reason, and obviously more important, is that I have a call for essays for a new collection that I'm putting together in which I'm exploring the Highlander franchise. So not just the first movie, but all the movies, including the second one. And they're on the television shows, the music, the collectibles, the comics, the video games, even fan fiction, all of it, looking to take a look at how the Highlander franchise has endured over these, 3+ decades.
And I think it's an interesting viewpoint to look at something that might be, just considered to be like low media. It's an 80s film, but, the fact that you're looking at it from an academic standpoint, you're looking at it from a pop scholarly standpoint, looking at themes, topics, things that are explored in the movie. I think that's where Pete, that's where we kind of enjoy that niche of conversation where, yes, we love these movies as kids. Maybe we've rediscovered them as adults and we see them for, we see the effects, we see the wires, we see, we see what's behind the scenes, but also we see the making of the film, the earnest awfulness we always talk about. And, some of that stew that makes something just timeless and leaves a legacy with folks like us.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely agree. I would say that I actually saw the movie as an adult because I'm older than both of you. So I think I remember back when it was in the theater. Not exactly. I was trying to actually remember if I'd seen it in the theater or if I saw it on, VHS back in the day after it had already been released. But I do recall it having a very specific resonance with me, the romance, obviously, but also the immortality of it. The fact that it wasn't a Dracula film or some sort of vampire film. This was a different kind of take on immortality. People that were human became immortal. Probably, obviously they were immortal for the entire time, just didn't know it. That's probably the biggest thing that kind of resonated for me. It was such a fascinating film and so different from anything else that I had seen up to that point. Definitely, I hate to say it, but there was a kind of magic about it at that time. Again, the themes, the stars in the film. I mean, you had Christoph Lambert, who I think I'd seen in Greystoke at that time, and then to turn around and see him in this film, brilliant young actor at the time. I fell in love with him, honestly. I thought he was great in both films. Sean Connery, of course, and that tie with the James Bond films that I love. Clancy Brown, obviously, who I didn't know anything about. And here he comes riding on this black steed and in this full black gear with leather and furs and gold accents and the skull around his head just being absolutely terrorizing, and just a scary dude. So and just the magic of it is what has kind of resonated for me. And I hadn't seen it for many years, and then I watched it about a month ago and was wondering, oh dear, does it hold up? And I have to say, for the most part, it did. And I kind of fell in love with it again. And then, of course, I watched it last night. Bernie, like you, I did enjoy seeing it again and realized just how much it does resonate through the ages, and it has timeless themes that I think, worked back then and it works today.
So, Michelle, you didn't see it in the theater when it first came out, correct?
I don't think so.
And it seems like from the box office, not many people did. It seemed to gain any traction when it was released on cable, when it was on VHS. So, Pete, I'm wondering, this is a movie that, I'm going to guess you probably also didn't see in theaters, and maybe that's how you caught it on cable or VHS?
Yeah, for sure. And it's very pleasing, Michelle, to hear you say that on rewatching it after so much time, that it holds up for you, because we've talked about that with other films in the past. And there's always times where, like, you have a certain memory associated with a movie that you saw at a certain point in your life. And there's always that trepidation, if you haven't seen it in a while, to be like, do I want to revisit it again? Is it, can I appreciate it from a different angle now that I'm older, or is it still going to resonate? And so to hear that it still does with you is very lovely to hear. I was telling Bernie before we came on, I hadn't seen this in a very long time. And I was kind of like, how much am I going to remember? Turns out not much at all. I have like these little like pictures. I certainly know the basic plot and what happened, but I was turned on to this movie because of my cousin Mark, and we watched a lot of movies. We did a lot of walks to the video store before Blockbuster, so the mom and pop stores, and we would rent 3 or 4 or 5 videos in a night. And this had to be probably 86, 87. It was definitely after it had left the theaters. Did not see it in the theater, but we saw this, pretty shortly after on VHS. And I remember even him at the time, he's like, you've got to watch this movie. It's great. It's about these immortal, beings, and they just go around beheading each other. And then, and as a 14, 15-year-old, I'm like, well, that sounds fantastic, of course. And so we definitely watched it. I remember liking it, but I just had not revisited it in full until last night, and I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, there's such, as you said, there's such a rich world that's there, and it really only kind of gets, the surface only is really scratched in the first Highlander. I feel like there's so much there. There's so much to mine from that. So I can totally see why this has become such a cult classic, and why it has like a huge sci-fi and fantasy following, because there's just so much there, and you're kind of like, where do you even start to dive into, which I guess is we'll have to start somewhere on this episode. So.
Sounds like a good place as any, Pete. I remember watching it on the local Fox affiliate. They would air, I've said this before, I'll say it one more time, every Saturday at like 5 o'clock, they would air movies from 5 to 7. And that's where I saw like Flight of the Navigator, Die Hard, Predator, all of these movies that are now 80s classics, even early 90s classics. I saw those during that time slot for the first time. And yes, they were edited for TV. So some of the content that I discovered later when I rented them on VHS was surprising. But that's how I saw Highlander. And same thing, like you, Pete, young kid watching this movie, everything, it ticked all the boxes. The sword play, the actions, the beheading, it was all there. I think watching it now and watching it very numerous times throughout the years, you notice, and this is something you mentioned on your blog article, Michelle, like the movie actually has a sense of humor as well that kind of goes with it. The fact that makes it kind of like this sword and sorcery genre, but displaced in, then modern day New York, also gives it kind of an interesting twist. But I think what always has helped me just always put Highlander in more high regard than some of the other 80s movies that haven't lived on. the high concept is just so solid. It just feels so simple that as a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid, I'm like, I get this. There can be only one. These guys are immortal. They're fighting each other. I understand that. There's this tournament. And then seeing it now, I think the high concept is there. Although, to be fair, we could argue it's maybe been diluted through the sequels and other media that have not taken that strong high concept and enriched it, rather just kind of diced it up and maybe done a disservice to it. But I think that's where, if we talk about the movie itself, released in 1986, and rather not getting into a Wikipedia part of it, but this is where, Pete, I saw a little bit of an intersection with some of your loves in life. So Russell Mulcahy, who directed it, he came from the world of music videos.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I did doing a little research after I watched it, to know that he had done music videos for Duran Duran, who I think was also attached before Queen got involved.
Really? Wow.
The soundtrack. Duran Duran was one of the bands that was bandied about as possibly, providing music for this. So there's all this interconnectivity there. But I absolutely loved, some of the set pieces. The final sword fight between, McLeod and McCurgan is so music video. It's so 80s music video. And when they crash through and they're in the warehouse and you've got like the backlit, the windows, and it's got like that cool 80s bluish vibe, and then of course the floor is wet, and so you've got the reflection coming off that. So music video-esque, and and a lot of the transitions that he did, going back and forth from present day to the past with just camera movements and dissolves and things like that, was just really, I thought, really super neat, the way that he did that. And I was shocked when I started watching it last night and saw the Canon Films logo come up, because I'm like, wow, I did not remember that this was a Canon film. And I'm like, and I don't know what the budget was on this, but it seems like it might be one of the biggest budgeted Canon Films movie ever produced. I don't know if that's true or not, but again, high concept, like it's there on the screen, from the location shoots in New York and Scotland. And wow, just incredible world building in this movie.
I did take a peek. The budget was $19 million.
I don't think it made its money back in the box office from what I read. But I think that's where Russell Mulcahy, I want to give him so much credit, because you see the movie and watching it now, having a little bit more, more of a background on film, and seeing, what cinematography, can be. There's a lot of low angles, which are kind of interesting. That shot in Madison Square Garden in the beginning during that wrestling match was one of the first times they ever used that camera that's now, just used about in every play in the NFL, the one that hovers over the field. And it was able to get that shot of Christopher Lambert, and just it reminded me, and this is probably the only time these two movies will ever be put in the same sentence, Highlander and Hitchcock's Psycho. But that scene in the beginning of Psycho where you see that slow movement into the hotel room, and the idea that Hitchcock wasn't able to accomplish that in one shot was always something that he was unhappy about, and then Gus Van Sant was able to do it with modern technology in the reboot or remake or whatever. We don't talk about that one. Nevertheless, but to be able to do that felt so, like watching it now, I'm like, this is so interesting that among this like cacophony of wrestling, which is an interesting way to start a thing about immortal warriors in a wrestling match, which is like perfect 80s. You have this camera that's probably sliding on this, I don't know, I'm assuming very like well reinforced rope of some sort towards Christopher Lambert's face. It's just like, hey, amongst all this stuff that's happening and all these spectators, this is the character we're supposed to watch. This is the character we're going to focus on. And I think some of that innovation, some of those different camera angles, I wonder if that comes from his time at like a kind of like a burgeoning music video scene, where I have to assume it's probably populated by like slighted filmmakers, people who didn't make it into that world. So, all right, well, if you have to tell a 90-something minute movie that's weighted, anchored by narrative, well, if you can't do that, well, then you can do a 3-minute, Bengals, Video Killed the Radio Star thing, where you can depend on quick edits, rhythm, motion, and kind of lean into the music. And I think that's what actually makes Highlander really interesting, is that some of those angles don't feel like they were in Lethal Weapon or other movies of that era where they were it's like, yeah, it's action, but this feels a little different. It feels a little artsy at times.
I would totally agree with that. And I feel like that opening scene is just incredible because, of course, today now, like you say, you've got, in the football arena, you can have this little camera. But I was even thinking about the fact that we have drones and how easy those are to use nowadays. You probably could have done something like that as well. And I was immediately struck by that scene, thinking, how did they do that? Because course, there wasn't drones back at that time, and I was just totally fascinated by how innovative that shot was, and it still felt fresh today, seeing that scene, and how it draws you in. I have to say that it's one of the best establishing shots in a film.
And to compare the characterization that it starts with, here's this guy who's in the middle of Madison Square Garden, but as we focus in on him, now we're going to a flashback to show Scottish clans fighting, facing off in the Highlands of Scotland to say, here are these modern day warriors fighting, albeit now like, it's 80s wrestling. So we all kind of laugh a little bit about it, but it's wrestling. It's real, right? And then you have these clans fighting. It's like, hey, there's some parallel that they're trying to make. And again, as a teenager, totally over my head, didn't make sense. I'm just like, I like wrestling and I like this action stuff with swords. This is great. Now seeing it, you have to just imagine that there's a little nuance there, but it's also kind of right in your face. Like, hey, I'm trying to draw a parallel about warriors and fighting and battle.
Yeah, I definitely felt that as well. Not in the first watch, because I hadn't been studying film at that time. And going back and taking a look and knowing more about how films are made, not just through film studies, but I've also Nicholas and I've been in a few films where we've been extras, and being able to be part of behind the scenes and see kind of how that magic happens has been helpful in kind of watching films and thinking about how they've put it together. The concept of the theme with the wrestlers at the front or at the beginning, and then the pan up through the ceiling, then brings you up from the ground up into the village where the McLeods are getting ready to go out and meet the Frasers. It really has a lot to say because Mulcahy comes back to that theme many times and does nice subtleties. That one's in your face. But you might remember when McLeod, Ramirez are in the village and they're talking, and behind the scenes, you can see, a couple of men, they're actually boxing in kind of a rustic ring. And it again kind of brings up the bravado of masculinity and just kind of how we can look at something back then and think, oh, that's, such an early time. But the way Mulcahy brings the two and juxtaposes the two together really kind of also lays bare that have we really come all that way? It's still part of those rituals that were then. We still have them today, but they're in a different kind of arena where it's more spectator related, a more voyeuristic engagement with violence, the bravado, the masculinity, the definition of masculinity. Whereas in McLeod's time, when he was in the Highlands, it was life and death, versus what you see with the wrestling, where, okay, we might think it might be life and death, but we know that it isn't. We know it's all choreographed. Whereas, back then in the Highlands, it wasn't. But at the end of the day, the perception isn't all that different from both.
And I find it's interesting because what I love about that opening scene is that it's very disarming, right? I mean, as a viewer, you're going in and you don't have a lot of information, again, because this is such a very unique film and a unique story that it's telling. You don't really have a lot to draw back when you're coming into it. So to open up on wrestling, which, was obviously popular in the mid 80s, but then to do that pan up and you've got McLeod sitting in the audience, everyone's going crazy. and he's just there, very contemplative. And so your brain is already like, okay, well, so what's going on with this guy? And then to immediately go from there to transition back to the past, and he's in Scotland. I mean, it kind of just lays bare the whole palette of like what you can expect from the movie, because I think you go into any film thinking that there's going to be certain beats and it's going to kind of establish some things, and I feel like right off the bat they're throwing some things at you that you're kind of like, okay, how do I get my brain around this? And then I guess it can work two ways. It can be very effective, or it could take you out of it. For me, I was just kind of like, all right, I'm in. Where's this going? And I thought that was just incredibly effective and you, again, unique for a film for that time period, I think.
Yeah. I think what works well with that scene too is the detachment that McLeod has for what's transpiring around him, and that will be a theme throughout. That sense of detachment as an immortal, and how you balance being kind of part of society, but also being outside of it, because you have this secret life, you have this secret, there's this whole other war that's going on that most of us, 99.9% of us are not aware of. So it definitely draws you in, because you wonder, why is he different? That was my immediate thought, was, why is he not watching what's transpiring? And he's obviously very different, because, you see the crowd and how they're reacting to the violence that's opening up on the mat. And he's kind of looking, but you can tell he's kind of off. He's thinking about other things. He's kind of like drawn back to reality when the fellow next to him, like, hey, why aren't you watching? Why aren't you taking an interest in this? So
I think there's an interesting subtext going on there too, that you kind of triggered me to think about when you're talking about how, because he's lived for, I think, 4 centuries at that point, and he grew up in that male violent battling clans, and here he is watching a very put upon facsimile of that in an arena. And I'm wondering, like, what's going through his head now, is like, as someone that has lived as long as he has, and seeing those echoes of like, well, this is kind of familiar to me on a certain level, but it's like now all these centuries later, and this is where we are. It's almost, it's not Roman arena because it's fake, but it's kind of like that. It's like a little bread and circus. And so now I'm like, there's this subtext there that you don't really get for the rest of the movie. It's kind of implied that he's got this struggle going on. It's never really overt that he's talking about it, but you're talking about that just triggered that in me again. Like, I'm trying to put myself in his mindset as he's sitting there in the arena and having these flashbacks. And it's like, what must be going through his mind for 400 or 500 years of like just seeing the same thing played over and over again. Again, just very, very interesting to just delve into.
And I think that's where that word detachment, Michelle, that you brought up, because I think that's probably demonstrated through those very seamless transitions that Mulcahy uses, and that initial one, which again feels very seamless and fluid. But I have to imagine, and this is kind of going to what you were saying, Pete, that an Immortals timeline, also like these transitions, is also very fluid. It's very seamless, because the past for them relates to the present in like a very different way, where there can be a moment in the present that reminds them of something similar that happened to them from an era long ago. In Connor's case, like you said, maybe centuries ago. And it would almost seem to be a blessing to have that kind of a long life. But it doesn't take very long in that case, when you're living for 300-400 years, to have your past outweighing your present. So in like a normal lifespan, where you'd have something that you were talking about, Michelle, you have these norms, and even like things like these male norms. There's these benchmarks in your life that you get old. And I was thinking again as a teenager, all right, grow old enough to kind of define yourself beyond your parents, and potentially meet someone, have kids, start a new life, personal, professional growth, all of these things that are out there, go through health challenges, and eventually you die, right? And that's kind of like this normal spectrum. But in an Immortals timeline, like on their spectrum, they're living in a world that's regulated by all those societal norms. So they're experiencing everything in real time. If they live for 100 years, they're older now, depending on when they became immortal, but they still have to live by the worlds that 99.9% of society around them has them live by. But their growth doesn't exist on that same XY axis regarding like time and existence. So what you and I might learn in 100 years, they also learn in 100 years, but then at 101, they get to start with all that knowledge of having lived beyond their parents, maybe meeting someone, losing someone, and then also figuring out, where do I mix in this world that doesn't embrace me, but I also can't be fully honest with it? Because if they knew who I was, well, that wouldn't work out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the Ramirez character played by Sean Connery, and the fact that at one point, he is talking to McLeod and telling him, hey, I was married 3 times, and how difficult that is to lose the love of your life 3 times over. And, he, as a mentor, subject matter expert on being immortal, is teaching a young McLeod who is immortal, and he's thinking, oh, I have all this time, and not realizing that at some point he has to let go of Heather, because she will grow old and she will die. The other thing he has to realize is that, they don't get to have kids together. The norm is that, you get married, you have kids, your legacy is carried on by your children. They learn, they evolve, they carry forward, and it continues. And now you've broken that cycle, because now McLeod is his legacy, and it, how he evolves through the ages. I was thinking about it earlier, how he keeps talking about like 1783, when he's an absolute drunk. And, he ends up in this duel. He stands back up, he gets poked, he's down, he gets back up, and he's finally, okay, I'm so sorry. So that's his lesson learned. But it's also, I was thinking about how he could be anything he wanted for as long as he wanted to be. And I think, we get that explored more through Duncan MacLeod through the television series. But here we have to condense it. So we get only kind of a snippet of some bits of his life over the ages and how that impacts him. So just find that fascinating.
There's some interesting similarities too with the like vampire lore, where you see the benefits of being immune to like sickness, having a long life, but those are then balanced by the inability to really connect with people, because you get to outlive them, because you get to define yourself, in some ways, in the best of ways, by doing, like you said, Michelle, anything you want. But eventually the world around you ages while you don't. And like you mentioned, Michelle, that idea of not being able to have kids, in some ways, I think it actually makes, in the world of the movie, it makes for a stronger characterization, because it just adds to the isolation, to the loneliness of being immortal, where, I'm thinking of, and I haven't seen it in a while, but the vampire movie, the famous one, Anne Rice.
Interview with a Vampire?
Interview with a Vampire, thank you. Where there's almost like a sense of fellowship that the vampires have found with each other, because they've realized that like they are their tribe. That's as close as they're going to get to relate to someone who also has lived and has the same, weaknesses, appetites that they do. Whereas the immortals feel like a bit of the opposite. It's Ramirez who seems to be one of the few in the group. And then, like you said, in the show, they explore it even further. But even within all of them, there's still this sense of loneliness and isolation. And Ramirez is almost like the unicorn that's like, well, I'm here to help you out because I kind of understand what you've gone through, because I've gone through it a few times over. So I'm actually trying to spare you heartache and pain. But, Connor, of course, being like all of us, is like, well, I haven't experienced that yet. So you're going to have to wait me out 100 years. And then I'll be maybe close to where you've been 3 times over.
Well, and I find it's interesting too, because, when you first get that flashback of he and Heather starting to build their life, and they've got their little castle there. It seems like that's all he just wants to have, that very simple life. He's very much in love with Heather. He wants to have that very stable just I'm blanking on the term, but he wants to have that type of life, even though that's not really going to be afforded to him. And
he wants the two goats and the stone fence.
yes, he wants, he just wants some goats. And I mean, I found his wooing technique very interesting, of just like dunking his head in a barrel of water. And I was like, oh,
you mean you weren't drawn in by that?
I mean, I haven't had that done to me personally or tried it, but now I feel like I want to, because that might be could be exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I feel if it was Christopher Lambert doing that, I might be susceptible to his wiles, maybe.
Yes, well, that long flowing hair that he had back in the day when he was in the Highlands of Scotland.
That's right.
But the vampire thing, I mean, obviously there's a lot of easy parallels there to is it Rachel is the girl that he finds in. I found their parallel there. It was reminding me a little bit on a much healthier level to Let the Right One In, where you've got the vampire's assistant, familiar if you're a fan of What We Do in the Shadows, but the person that is a companion that you actually see grow from a child to a woman by the end of the film, but not a parasitic one. There's obviously a lot of love and care there that goes on, but there was something about that was striking me of like, especially like at the end of Let the Right One In, where from the beginning of that movie, where you've got like the one assistant that is basically driven insane because they're there to serve the vampire, and and it just doesn't end well. And then in this instance, obviously a much different relationship, but I was struck by some of the parallels there as well.
First, so glad you brought up Let the Right One In, because that's a fantastic vampire film and completely undervalued. Definitely the original. Read the book, loved both. But I would agree with you. We focus so much on the romance of the film, and there's definitely that. He has the romance with Heather, he has the romance with Brenda, but there's also the relationships, obviously those two, but there's the relationship between Ramirez and McLeod, and then in turn McLeod and Rachel. And it really does give you insight into McLeod, the man, the humanity that's still within him. He hasn't lost that over the 400 years. And if anything, he is a romantic. He's a sentimentalist. And that's something that I think that we all appreciate. And I think it's part of why we're able to identify with someone who is immortal, that allows us in. As much as he's detached, I think we learn so much about him in, the little over 2-hour movie that we watch.
And I think you see some of those romantic tendencies in his exchanges with Rachel. Like there seems to be, I don't know, I guess you could go both ways now. Maybe it was strictly a paternal relationship where after saving her, you can almost play out the movie in your head. It's 1940 something during World War II in Europe. He's able to save her, make their way out of Europe, maybe make their way to New York, and they establish a new life there. He takes her in. I would imagine until a certain age, it's kind of a foregone conclusion that that's her father, and maybe that's the roles that they play for some time. And then as he establishes himself, let's assume that antiquities business is something that he's had for some time. Then she takes on a role as like the front of the house, maybe running the business, maintaining, his sanity, let alone, his identity as far as what's going on. But I don't know, there's a part of me that would also think, could there have been at some point throughout their existence, maybe something more intimate, something that where like maybe it did grow beyond that. But I don't know. There's times where I see it and I thinking about that, Michelle, I'm like, I don't know. There's times where he touches her. It feels like, not having a daughter myself, I'm definitely out of place to say this. It feels like the touch of a father, like honoring, respecting a daughter and being like, we've been through a lot, and I have no secrets from you. Like, I'm immortal. So like you've seen me, and I also see you, and I understand like I kind of have needed you all of these years, but also that I also need other things. And that's where you see the love interest in the movie that takes up a lot of time when you do have this maybe a different kind of romance, but it's that's staring you right in the face.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about how, as McLeod gets ready to leave to go fight the Kurgan in the climactic scene in the third act, that, he's like, he is very fatherly. He's like, I've taken care of you, Rachel. Everything's taken care of. You will not have to worry about anything. And I think that if there wasn't that investment of himself to her, and that ability to be able to connect with her, she does say that she can see that he's still lonely. So that would lead me to think that, it is a very respectful but platonic relationship, because he did take a fatherly role with her. And it's a very touching moment. It's very sad, that it's his time to move on, and, she will go on and finish her life however way that she does. We don't know. So there is sadness, again, that sentimentality that really resonates for all of us, and I think it's part of what makes this film have such an enduring power over the decades.
I do think that the comment you just made, Michelle, makes it interesting. So I'm like, yes, that moment where Rachel literally says, like, I know you're lonely. And thinking about that early in, like, the whole vampire idea and the immortal idea with loneliness, I wonder, though, if that also flies in the face of the fact that he has a public face. Like, he is an antiques dealer, and you just imagine, based on his immortality, he would have access to resources, to things that would make him financially set, where, you saw his apartment and it's in New York. I think he's doing okay. But all of these things kind of wrap together. You don't think that, like, financially he's fine. But he's also not hiding, like I would imagine. Again, this is kind of unfair because we see this in other sequels and in the TV series. But he could be better at hiding, considering while he uses the basically dead baby identities to hide his names. But he still has a public figure. He has a storefront where people can come and kind of dig into his past. And if he doesn't give people reason to come, which is really the whole motivation of the plot, he does by getting captured by the police in those first 10 minutes. If not for that, the rest of the movie, the romantic interest, nothing happens, because they never realize, hey, Russell Nash may have been someone else. And Pete, you were going to talk about a quiz of some sort, maybe going into some of the identities.
Sure. Yeah. We'll do that. But quick point before we do that, just from a visual standpoint, just kind of putting a little bow on the Rachel McLeod relationship. When he does finally, leave, when he's leaving his apartment, and she's, up there on the balcony, he's in the elevator going down. I think that, again, that from a visual standpoint, and this, Michelle, is kind of like the reverse from what you were talking about at the beginning, where you go from a shot of him in the arena to panning upwards through the ground. And now we're in Scotland. And now here it is reversed, where he's taking the elevator down, and she's like, this is probably the last time that I'm going to see you, because she figures out you're not coming back whether you live or die. This is it. So I thought, again, just from a visual standpoint and the storytelling standpoint, kind of doing that like reversal. And again, there's like that flow and that beat, and I think a talented director could certainly do that. But again, maybe something being involved in music videos, tying that in, maybe there's something there too. But yeah, so there's a great scene later on in the film where oh boy, I'm blanking on the character's name. It's coming to me.
Brenda.
Brenda is doing some research because she's got some questions about Russell, and she goes to her partner, who is doing handwriting analysis, and he's got a very 80s computer with a series of names through the ages that he picks out the different letters, and it forms Russell Nash's name. And he's like, well, this guy's been around since at least the 1780s or something like that. When, and of course that's blowing everyone's mind. But there were a series of names on that screen of aliases that McLeod used over the years. And so I'm going to, and this goes out for Michele and Bernie. Either of you can chime in on this, but I'm going to give you 5 names. 4 of those names are correct, but one of these names I have made up. And let's see if you can guess which one does not appear on that screen. Okay, are we ready?
Oh, we're ready.
Okay.
So there can be only one.
Fake alias for McLeod. Okay, so the names I have are Adrian Montague, Jacques Lefebvre, Alfred Nicholson, Templeton Peck, and Rupert Wallingford. Do you know which is the false name out of that group?
I have a guess. I remember
Michele,
the scene very well.
Throw out your guess, Michele, and then I'll guess right after you.
I'm thinking Lefebvre, that fellow.
Oh, hold on. That's it. Correct. Okay. I was
the same?
I was gonna dig into Pete's love for hockey and say that just sounds like such a hockey name, but that's a Canadian hockey star that Pete loves from some team that's forgotten. That's it. I was actually gonna go with Templeton Peck, thinking that I'm like, wait, isn't that Face's name from A-Team?
Oh, that's a good.
You are correct, Bernie. That is Templeton.
Yeah, Templeton. Yeah.
Okay.
So yes.
Okay.
I was trying to think of something that could fit in with that other group. I'm like, Templeton Peck is a wild and crazy name, and yes, also from the A-Team. So you win.
Very cool.
I do love it when a quiz comes together.
Good.
So I have like 3 things. I thought one of them was just inspired by something that you said earlier, Michele, but just really because I found this online, I thought was kind of interesting. So Christopher Lambert was the one who won the role of Connor McLeod. Just to show you the era when this was out there, other people that were considered for the role of Connor: Michael Douglas, Sam Shepard, Kevin Costner, Sting, Mickey Rourke, Mark Singer, everyone loves Beastmaster, and Mel Gibson. And one of the other original choices for Duncan McLeod was actually Kurt Russell, after he'd been in John Carpenter's Escape from L.A., but instead he went on to do Big Trouble in Little China. But it's not Connor that I wanted to talk about. I actually wanted us to dig into the Kurgan, and it was from that thing you mentioned earlier, Michele, about his design. Because first time I saw him, and I didn't have that knowledge as a kid, but I do now, he looks like a Frank Frazetta painting. He looks like a cover from some European metal album, and when you see it now, it's like, wait, was that some sort of saber-toothed tiger? Because how old is he? Was he there at a time when he found that and he kind of appropriated that into his like warrior garb? But there's just something really interesting about the Kurgan that I thought, well, we kind of know a little bit about Connor, but let's dig into him a little bit and talk about the villain.
And I just want to say real quick, I'm not up on my Comic Cons. I've been to a few, but I'm not a regular con goer. But I feel like that outfit should be featured more.
I agree.
It's like ready made for some cons.
Yes, it's cosplay ready. Like you should just be able to go on Amazon, put in Kurgan, and just get that the next day.
Yeah, but I digress. Sorry.
Or to take the time to make it. It's an incredible costume, and I feel like if there was somebody out there that wanted to cosplay and they were 6'5", that would be very, very intimidating. Bernie, to your point, it is Frank Frazetta inspired. I'm not sure which one, but I know that Death Dealer was around maybe a little bit after that, but I don't remember the whole repertoire of Frazetta and his work.
And it's that very iconic shot of Death Dealer on the horse. When you see that in that shot, that's what I thought of. And it just imagining that may have been in the ether, pulp novels, Ronnie Howard. Like you put that all together, is that what inspired at least the look of the Kurgan?
I did read that is Frazetta is one of the inspirations for that outfit.
And it's interesting compared to Connor, who has attachments in Rachel, who has a love interest through the movie. Kurgan, who feels like he's been around longer, who feels like he's been a warrior or something similar to that in different eras. He feels more like a character that's lost touch with humanity. He's disconnected, he's displaced, and feels more like a warrior, but like even his look has like this caveman brutishness about him. But then again, even to be fair, he knows Def Leppard because he quotes them in the lyric in the church, like, better to burn in hell than to fade away, right? Mm-hmm. And in the car when Freddie Mercury singing the New York, New York, it seemed to me like the Kurgan was singing along while he's driving that poor woman, the poor victim in the car crazy. So it doesn't seem like he's completely detached from the world because he obviously has a radio and he's listening to, 80s jams, on whatever was the station in New York.
He's clearly embraced the 80s hair metal scene, and he's definitely loving that aspect of his immortality. Yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure when Terminator came out, but to know that if it was inspired by Frazetta, that scene where he leaves the hotel feels like, I think right before he fights Castigear in that back alley. I mean, that's just that low angle feels like a shot from Terminator, with the leather and everything. He's about to go out to battle, and but there's also a coldness, something very robotic about his movements. And you just think that's, while Connor sometimes can feel cold, there's still at least some connection with him. I don't know. I think the Kurgan is just such an interesting character because at times he feels like such a brute, but then you have the church scene where, again, he's quoting rock and roll, but he also respects the idea of holy ground. Yeah. Like, he's not so brutish to say, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want. Like, no, sorry, Connor. Like, we still have to go by the rules.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you picked that up. I'm actually reading a book called A Kind of Magic, Making the Original Highlander. It's by Jonathan Melville. And he actually... This is a great book, by the way. So I don't know if either one of you read it or not. Sorry, my thing's like, there you go. But Jonathan Melville interviewed so many people for this book. So you really get a wonderful cross section of voices, from the actors to the crew. You really get a better understanding than you would necessarily with a behind the scenes that's been very kind of like catered to a specific audience. Melville also uses the shooting script to walk through Highlander, which I thought was really fascinating, instead of going by the film and this is the first scene, this is how they did it, and let's talk to these people. He did it by the shooting script, which I thought was really fascinating. I think what really works for this book. But he did interview Clancy Brown, and Clancy Brown was very, very interested in the Kurgan and had very strong opinions about how he wanted to portray the Kurgan. He really resonated with the original script that was by, was it Gregory Wyden, rather than the movie script. So he really went into thinking about the Kurgan tribe, that you are immediately correct. It is a very, very old tribe. As Romero says, it's on the steppes of Russia, very kind of sadistic, brutal. The Kurgan always kind of reminded me of somebody who, unlike Ramirez, who has a refinement, I don't think the Kurgan also has a refinement, but it depends what it is. So, for instance, with his sword, that is everything to him. You see when he, sets down the box, he opens it up. There's very beautiful writing that none of us can read, but it looks really pretty. He puts his sword together. He's very driven, ambitious. And that was one of the things that Clancy Brown really wanted to try and get across, that he isn't just some crazy fellow that's been, gone insane because of being alive forever and ever. But he really wanted it to be more of, look at this character who has been driven by ambition. He wants power. He is not like lost touch with the world around him. And I think that's brilliant that you brought up the fact that he's quoting Def Leppard. He's singing, Frank Sinatra as he's going across the bridge in New York, and just different. He is able to be kind of in touch with the world, even though he still hasn't lost sight of, one, what he's after, two, the ritual. What didn't make it into the film, and it's I'm kind of sad that it didn't. When McLeod and Castigar get together, apparently it didn't make the film, but they actually talk about getting together and basically ganging up on the Kurgan to kill him. And that is also kind of like part of the ritual as an immortal, that you don't do that. It's one fight, one person against another person. And so I think leaving that out was a good thing to do, because otherwise you would have gotten kind of like mixed messages about who McLeod is. And I think it would have clouded the fact that I think it would have diminished the Kurgan and his focus on the ritual. The fact the church, you don't fight in the church, you fight 1-to-1. There will be a time when you will have to fight each other. He's respectful of that time, and he doesn't have a problem waiting if he has to.
I didn't know that scene. I'd heard that there was a fire at some point where there was some footage for the film that was lost. Didn't know about that scene, Michelle, but I think I agree. I'm glad that scene was not in the movie. Because that scene in the bridge, and I'm assuming that's Central Park, where
yes.
Connor and Castigar are meeting, they seem to have a real friendship, a fellowship amongst people who are probably, again, maybe, isolated, see each other. Or he actually makes the line, I'm sorry, like, I haven't seen you, it's been like 100 years. And Connor jokingly like, it has been 100 years. But Castigar, when he talks about the gathering, there's an excitement. Like at some point he's like, hitting the bridge. Like there's something like, he's like, yeah, this is finally going to happen. This thing that we're all waiting for, this ritual that we've been building up for. But at the same time, you have to imagine that there's these warriors that know that they'll eventually confront each other, but they still have that respect. So it wouldn't make sense that they would want to gang up on the Kurgan when the Kurgan himself, even though he seems to be the villain, he's still kind of playing by the rules. And I think that's probably where I imagine Clancy Brown is seeing the fact that, yeah, this guy looks like the bad guy and feels like the bad guy, but he's just another immortal who's just kind of doing it his own way. He wouldn't be the one that would set up an antiques dealership or maybe take in a girl in World War II. That's not him. That's not who he is. Maybe he's a mercenary during World War II. Maybe he's like, plays like a Hessian during the British American War or something, that like maybe he's gravitating towards skirmishes, towards places of, instability. Maybe, but he just also doesn't feel like the guy who's at the cause of it. He would be Genghis Khan's best warrior, but I don't know that he would beat Genghis Khan. He doesn't seem like the guy who would want the throne, but he would happily delight in being on the battlefield in service of someone else. And even in that first battle, I'm here just to fight these guys. But as long as we're in agreement, there's someone up there called Connor, right? Yep. Well, that's who I want. And if this happens to serve your needs, I'll mow the people on the way to him, and they just happen to be the enemy. That's fine. But I also don't care for your cause. I'm just here for the guy's head.
Definitely a mercenary type of position, and one that, has worked well for him through the many millenniums that he's been around.
I was gonna say, he seems to embrace his immortality a bit more than McLeod. McLeod, it seems to weigh on him a bit, to the point where I think Brenda says, like, you're afraid of living, essentially. Like, he's like, I can't get involved in a relationship. Like, all these things that have weighed on him because of his past experiences, with Heather and things like that. Whereas the Kurgan is more just kind of embracing the fact that, like, well, I feel like I'm the strongest one here. Yes, I was almost beheaded by Sean Connery, but I made it through, and I've got this really cool scar on my neck. And so I'm just going to go through life, and, I'm going to drive my fast cars. I'm going to play my heavy metal music, and I'm just going to live it up as much as I can. I'm curious to know, and Michelle, I don't know if you know this or not, but when Bernie mentioned some of that footage that was burned and lost, one of the minor issues that I had with, certainly from the beginning part, I felt like the Kurgan seemed to me more of like an avatar at first, where he's like in that one scene, and then he disappears for a while, and then of course he busts down the door in the castle, to come from a cloud and has the battle with Ramirez. It seemed like there was maybe some room there to maybe flesh out his character a little bit more, because when you see him again, like in that church scene, he's playing it up. He's really relishing the fact that he's there on that sacred ground, and and kind of having fun with this, what I'm sure he probably considers this minor religion that has absolutely no bearing on his life or his his ambitions in immortality and in life. So I don't know if there was a scene earlier on that got lost, but I'd be curious to know if that existed or was shot.
I don't recall in my reading. I'm not through the book, so there might be something more further in. I think I still got about 100 pages to go. But I'll definitely loop you guys back in if I happen to read something. Unfortunately, I don't know for during this time for recording. I think what does work in the favor of not having anything is that not knowing is more terrifying than knowing. And I think that this is a case where you have such a badass. Are we allowed to swear?
Oh, by all means, yes.
Oh,
and you
okay.
just did, so perfect.
Okay. You have this fellow that is just a terrifying looking person. He's got a presence that's just very, very scarish and nightmarish. So I think that if we knew more about him, there might be an opportunity to kind of humanize him. And everything that we've seen leads to believe that he is not a good person. We don't need to really know his story necessarily, because what Clancy Brown does with that portrayal of the Kurgan is spot on. He did exactly what he needed to, and it's a scary portrayal. And I think it really works. I kept thinking back to, where was Connor when Ramirez and Heather were at the table that night? Mm-hmm. And I was like, why wasn't Connor there? And then I got to thinking, well, he could have been off doing harvest or, something like that. And that would be the time that Kurgan would go in there, because that's respecting the ritual of the fight, is to head on and only deal with one. And the fact that, he thinks that Heather is Ramirez's woman because, he's just following that. Hey, I sense there's an immortal. Oh, great. It's Ramirez. I'm going to take care of him, particularly since, Kurgan finds out that, Ramirez has taken him under his wing, and he's probably aware he's in the area. It's only been 5 years since he encountered Connor on the field of battle. So, it's very possible that he just kind of lingered around and waited. And then Ramirez came, and that was his shot. One thing that I hadn't noticed until I read in the book, and then I was really watching for it. Kerrigan in modern times, don't know if you noticed, he has Ramirez's earring hanging off of his jacket. And I was like, oh my God, I never noticed that. But then when I was watching, I was like, there's the pearl. I thought that was perfect.
That's a nice little touch. I did not pick up on that either.
I wonder if he would be the type of warrior that you would see it on face value as being, disrespectful, but maybe even the opposite. Because I think, Michelle, what you're talking about with the rituals he has with putting his sword together, not wanting to be disturbed, even that, it just seems cool for the camera, but when he kind of does the thing with the sword, or he kind of puts it across his arm, his chest, just to show that it's well balanced. Like, that feels like a craftsman, someone of skill that is putting the time to make sure his tools are in good order, because he knows how to use them. You have to imagine, some of these immortals must have, blacksmith type skills, because that's literally what keeps their head on, is being able to make these weapons and make the best versions of them. So he doesn't seem like a Luddite. He seems like someone who would know technology, would know these things. But then in having that earring, is that a part of him that's almost, again, just goes back to the ritual? Is he taking something from every immortal that he beheads in a way of honoring them? Like, he feels like that warrior that, maybe not so like Hearts of Darkness, Apocalypse Now, I have an earring, a necklace full of ears kind of thing. But, something in that manner, he's like, yeah, I took something from this person because I honor the fact that I have their knowledge, their soul, whatever. And that is the next thing I definitely want to talk about, is the idea of the quickening. But that feels like that's who Kurgan is. Like, he is a little complex. He's mysterious. I think in the same ways that the quickening is mysterious. So that beginning voiceover by Ramirez, we get I'm going to have to read it here. From the dawn of time we came, moving silently through the centuries, living many lives, secret lives, struggling to reach the time of the gathering, and the few who will remain will battle to the last. No one has ever known we are among you until now. What did you guys have any sense for what the quickening, the prize, the rules, all these rituals are? Because they seem to be, as much as they are defined, they seem to be ambiguous.
Yeah, super ambiguous, which I think, again, lends itself to an appreciation of the movie, because there's a lot that is sort of explained. I mean, when Ramirez comes on the scene, there's definitely a lot of exposition that he's imparting knowledge on McLeod and by turns the audience. But again, there's so much that's left to the imagination. I mean, I even look at the end of the film when they're back in Scotland and he's talking, I think it's his voiceover is talking about he now has all this knowledge that he feels that he can communicate and connect with world leaders, and how he can impart this on them and maybe make the world a better place. I mean, you're talking about just really taking what we just saw for the past 2 hours and then just blowing the doors, wide open as to where it could go from there. So like it's leaving you on this thing. I'm like, oh wow, like you can really, this can go in any number of directions, and I like that. And having not seen the sequels or the TV show or any of the supplemental materials, I don't have a knowledge if any of this was explored, but I did like that, again, for just taking it as a compact movie. There was a lot there, a lot was explained. There was a lot that was just left to the imagination, which I think is probably part of the movie's charm too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like the beginning, there's definitely that ambiguity about, well, what is this about? Is it a secret society? What kind of secret society is it? Is it the Illuminati that we are familiar with in Tomb Raider? Or is it, the Freemasons that, or any other number of secret societies? So immediately for me, I was like, ooh, what is this all about? I'm very curious. And then, I think the Ramirez character really does help to kind of flesh out the basics so that we're not lost when, the gathering, the quickening, when you hear the thunder, or why, they are able to sense others in the area, that they know that one of their kind is nearby. I wanted to go back real quick and that is with regards to the Kurgan and the Ramirez's pearl. I kind of see it as a almost like a badge of honor, in that if you look back to, like, I think the Red Baron, he would mark off every time he was able to shoot down an airplane. I get the sense that the Kurgan felt that Ramirez was probably at that time his most formidable opponent. And when he did kill him and take his head, he honored that kill. I don't know that he would have any others necessarily, because we know that Ramirez was actually an Egyptian, so he was very, very old as well. And, might have been, we'd never know if Ramirez was the oldest. Of course, if you go into the series, we find out that
Mythos.
Yeah, I think it's Mythos is actually 5,000 years old. and he's actually the oldest. So it's it's left to explore, and I will say thank goodness for the television series that able to flesh out some of this other stuff. But I do feel that we get enough where it's an enjoyable experience. Just enough of the mythology is teased at us. We get enough that we can kind of hang our ideas and our understanding of what we're experiencing on the screen, and enough to be entertained and brought along for the ride for the 2 hours. Now, you didn't get to see the second one, but I think it does kind of help explain a little bit why McLeod does what he does in the second one by building the shield, is that he is trying to protect humanity. And he does make, if there was going to be the last immortal, the fact that his sentimentality and his humanity is still intact when he does win the quickening, it makes sense. It makes sense, some of his actions, in the second one and beyond.
And that's where Ramirez makes the comment how he's worried if the Kurgan were the last one, how he would use the prize and maybe in some ways hurt humanity. And you got to wonder if the Kurgan had actually been ultimately the one, what would it look like? Would it look more like, would he be like that modern day Genghis Khan, where I feel like he wouldn't be that type of ruler? Would he retreat into isolation, not necessarily hurt humanity, but unlike Connor, who has that sentimentality, also not use his prize to help humanity like proactively, which again, like you said, Michelle, it's tackled in the sequel, but that enlightenment that Connor at least has where before we see him making the life for himself without drawing attention, and even though he has these resources, maybe that awareness doesn't happen until he's the one, because now he has presumably the perspective of Ramirez and the Kurgan before, hey, I'm just going to set up a shop and there's this lovely woman in Rachel and we have kind of, this father-son life together and I'm okay with that. And on occasion, maybe a romantic interest or something changes his growth. But for the most part, his life is fairly the same, and it's not until he becomes the one that he realizes maybe I'm not going to be as selfish with myself, and I'm actually going to help humanity. And like you mentioned, Pete, where he talks about I'm going to get diplomats to almost like talk to each other, and I'm going to try to do something. And then the sequel, and I think this is where Pete, you don't have to go much further maybe than the sequel after that, at least in the world of the movies. And I think this is where, Michelle, as you're, for your call for papers, as you're looking at it from that academic pop scholarly viewpoint, the movies eventually just go off the rails. Whereas maybe that's the best thing about this premise, is that the movies probably should just have been one, because the best way to look at it is actually not to go forward, but to go backwards. And through the character of Duncan in the series, you get to explore the past. That's where it's kind of interesting. That's where you get really into like the protein of the character building, and something that you almost would imagine go that route with Connor instead of what they did in the other sequels, because it just feels like there's so much there. You mentioned, Michelle, I was thinking when Ramirez is mentoring him, but then he has McLeod focus on the deer's heart. And once Connor is able to kind of sink in with the animal, they start running on the beach, and it seems like they're keeping up with the gait of the deer. And then at some point, Ramirez yells out like, "Oh, this is the quickening." Watching it again, I thought, I don't know that he's being literal, but I think the idea is like there's some sort of communion with nature. I mean, that sounds really cheesy, but new agey, but maybe that's what it is, that there's some sort of, like it's the spidey sense for immortals, where they can sense each other, they can feel each other in the same ways that they can be in tune with nature. That feels like the best explanation we actually should get, because we shouldn't dig into the source of immortality. It should remain somewhat mysterious, even just like the Kurgan. We shouldn't know how this happens. And there's even that scene later in the zoo where Connor is with Brenda. Thank you. Fan2Fan Podcast officially apologizes to Brenda, where he's with Brenda and he connects to the two lions that are kind of circling each other. And I know it's supposed to be like very on the nose, like, oh, look, the two lions and Kurgan and Connor will fight. But the lion looks at him, and then there's some sort of knowing glance, and then it moves away as if to be like, yeah, he's the apex predator here. So I'm just going to walk away from this being, this person. I think all of that is just really interesting because it's not explored. But like you said, Michelle, there's just enough.
Well, and that's interesting about the nature and the natural, because that is explored in the second one. The fact that the danger to humanity, it relates to our relationship with nature. Also, in the original film, it's set in Scotland partially, which is a very natural environment. It's really a way to commune with nature and to become grounded. So it does kind of make sense that would kind of come all together, and that he would be looking at, how do I help people to talk to each other? Because of course he has the experience, even though he's only been around 400 years at that point, a little over 400 years. He does see enough how we don't communicate with each other. We tend to, again, kind of look at, our rituals. We kind of hold on to those and what they say about us and to others. And he knows that in order to kind of bridge that gap, he had to go back to where he began, where he felt that sense of nature, where he felt that heartbeat, where he felt that connection. So it's very interesting that he actually ends up back there again.
Especially, I think, with the mystery of the quickening and, his origin. Like, he seems to be grounded in nature, and that seems to be something that becomes more tactile for him. Like, if I go back to this place, I'll have this feeling again, like that awareness, that re-energizing, who knows what it is. The what got him there, the quickening, the immortality, the fact that, yes, it's mysterious, but I just think it's so interesting that it's also juxtaposed by these very specific rules. Can't have kids. You have to respect holy ground. There's this gathering that they're all somewhat aware of. It seems like it's not like they get an invitation or an evite. Like, they're just like, yeah, hey guys, it's time, and this is it. The fact that they know that beheading is part of a ritual in order to gain the quickening and kind of like best your opponent. The fact that, yeah, there can be only one, and that there's this prize. It just begs those questions, at least it did for me, like, where do these things come from? I'm glad that they were unexplored, and that Pete, like, they kind of left you at the end with, this will be interesting to see where this goes. But the fact that there was enough here that if you just saw this, you would walk away with a lot of questions, but also a lot of satisfaction, I would hope.
Yeah, I would hope that it would also bring about a lot of conversation about what the prize actually was for Connor at the end of the film, and that, it isn't about riches as much as it is about the connection with humanity. At the end of the day, that's the prize.
Well, let me ask you both a question, because that's perfect. Do you think the prize is real, and not necessarily, like, it's not wealth, right? Do you think it's literally just it's more knowledge that's somehow external, right? Because maybe this is more. The sum is, this is either one of two things, at least in my mind. I'm going to just be very binary here. But there's one version, right, where you kill all these people, you become the last one, and then, yes, you have the knowledge, the accumulated knowledge of those before you, right, that you bested. But then there's something else, something bigger that now gives you that awareness that Connor alludes to, right? Like being able to talk to diplomats, doing better for humanity. Or is it literally just more of like that, I think it's gestalt, right? Like the sum is bigger than the whole. Like, is that what this is? The fact that, well, yeah, every immortal that you killed before you probably killed an immortal before them. And it's not that there is a prize. That's the prize. Like, you now have Ramirez's and Kurgan's and Castigiers and the dude that looks like the Equalizer in the first scene in the garage scene. You get all of their stuff together. That's what you get. And hopefully you get someone like Connor that has some touch to humanity, and that's how it'll get used. But do you think there actually is something else beyond that?
I actually think that it's not only the experiences of all the immortals that are all the souls and all their experiences that the final one receives. But if I remember correctly, right at the end, McLeod does talk about the fact that he can hear all. And so to me, I take that in this case literally, that he can hear everyone, and that that does a lot to be able to kind of bridge those gaps. One would hope that there would be a hope that he's able to get people to come to the table, so to speak, because there won't be any BS between them. You know, he'd be able to mediate that conversation and say, oh, well, Mr. X, I know what you're thinking. You know, you're not being, truthful and honest to this approach. You know, hey, Mr. Y, hey, you're on, that's a great idea. Let's discuss it, type of thing. With that said, I think about how we see McLeod struggle with his history, with what he sees around him. And now suddenly you hear everyone. How do you mediate that? Where do you start? And how do you not go crazy with all those voices? That's what I was left with.
And it's interesting that you talk about the how do you not go crazy, because that was one thing that kept echoing with me as I was watching it. Because I understand, the back and forth through time with him remembering his past is used as a storytelling device. But taking it the level further, you don't get the sense that Ramirez or the Kurgan are having similar angst or anomie, as it were. Like, and obviously we're not spending as much time with those characters, and maybe because they've been around longer, they've learned to channel and control that. But I was wondering, like, was this something to do with the quickening or the gathering? Like, because like this event was coming close to happening, was this triggering something in McLeod to start having these, these flashbacks, or is this something that has just been with him for 400 some odd years?
It's kind of like the culmination of this gathering is kind of inciting those flashbacks.
Yeah. So I was curious. I'm like, oh, is this what's going on? Or is this just him trying to process being alive for 400 plus years? How does someone compartmentalize? How does someone deal with that? Is this him maybe going a little bit crazy? Because you can easily see, again, like when you live that long and you even if you're detached from people and from humanity, you're going to have relationships, even if they're very superficial, and to see people come and go and to grow old and die, like, and which would happen with his wife, Heather, to experience that, like, is this him kind of going insane in some way, or is this him trying to keep his sanity in some way? And those are questions that just kept reverberating through my mind. In terms of the prize, this was before the internet, but I was imagining, like, having like an Immortals app, and then like when he defeats the Kurgan, it's like a badge shows up of like, so, but yeah, I think I would agree with both of you that it's something other than, it's the culmination of the knowledge and the experience, and I don't know if they absorb. Obviously, something happens when they decapitate a rival, that, windows blow out, things happen, and there seems to be something that takes over their bodies in that moment. But I don't know, is that them absorbing the other immortals' knowledge and experiences, or is it something else? And again, that's not explained, and I like that that's kind of kept to the imagination, because we can have discussions about it and be like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, who knows?
That's true. The only thing they ever illustrate is in that last scene. And again, it could be just because he is the last one, where you get all of those creatures. And at some point, I was trying to pause, and it seemed like it was a dragon of some sort.
Yes.
Like these kind of ghostly beings, right, that are going around him, that I then saw in like a making of thing that were also put in there to hide the wires that were holding up Christopher Lambert. So they kind of worked around it for that. But that's really the only time where, outside of windows breaking and lightning, that you get something else beyond that. So they don't mention it. You're right, Pete. Like maybe there's an assumption, and again, knowing from the other stuff that's come out of Highlander, the other mythology, okay, well maybe it's that, but it could just as well in this movie not be. It could just be a badge. You've killed off one person, and that person no longer exists, and there's something very dramatic, something that's happening because of that death, but you're just as smart or as dumb as you were before. You don't get to have Ramirez's knowledge on top of this as well.
Which would make sense because Ramirez is imparting a lot of knowledge on McLeod when he meets him. So I feel like if it was a case where if eventually McLeod had to defeat him in battle, then he would gain that knowledge. Like there's obviously a purpose for Ramirez to be like, I want you to have this knowledge now so that you can grow in the now and not get it from possibly cutting my head off, which I would prefer you not do.
And I'm going to assume, Michelle, you've seen the series, so this is not playing fair for Pete, who has not. But I remember in the series, there were things like good and bad quickenings. Mm-hmm. And, it's like all of this stuff is just like, I'm putting this all through the lens of comics, right? Being able to read, what's that?
Is that like heartburn? Like, it's like, I had some bad.
Well, I'm like, being able to read everyone's mind, immediately I thought of Cerebro. And, just being able to kind of do that. The fact that they seem to be immortal, but not, he still has holding pins to hold his neck together, the Kurgan is. So it seems like they can be scarred physically. As long as you don't get beheaded, I guess you could have an immortal without an arm, a limb or something. It just seems anything fatal would remedy itself. But in the series, you have the good and bad quickenings where if you absorb the quickening of a quote unquote bad immortal, you might start taking on that person's traits. So, if someone, or opposite, if there was a villainous immortal and they took, say, Ramirez's, I'm going to assume the Ramirez's was probably good, that he would change. By the context of the movie, it wouldn't work because, I don't know, wouldn't Kurgan then maybe be a bit less villainous than we saw him towards the end? Because he had taken Ramirez's, let alone Castigier, who seemed to be on the quote-unquote good side of the Immortals. And that just reminds me of like good and black, like red and green kryptonite for Superman, where it has different impacts. The series delves into it a little bit more. Does Highlander, the movie doesn't. But the fact that they do kind of go into the quickening a bit more and try to flesh it out.
Yeah, we even see Facile and at the beginning, the Equalizer dude. And with Castigier, I think both of their energies were kind of a blue. And I think for Kerrigan, he was more of a red. Now, I do remember reading in the book, in Melville's book, that they were originally talking about that McLeod would be able to kill him, but then he'd also have to kill this additional creature, the dragon. And it didn't end up, they didn't work it that way. And I think that would have really confused the mythology. And you're right. I mean, they do cover it more in the series. And I think there's even been talk about like the color of the energy being blue, or if it's a red, it means that, it's more of a villainous energy. And I'm trying to remember, because I watched the first season again. I haven't seen all of the episodes.
By season 6, it's a hard watch, Michelle. Because at that point, there's actually a spin-off, The Raven, where they take that Catwoman type character and give her her own series. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But in those first few seasons, they do a really good job of dealing with Duncan and his past and trying to actually differentiate him from Connor, because they feel on face value it's like, wait, isn't that just the guy, but maybe you couldn't afford the guy, so you bring in this other guy with a ponytail? Like, that doesn't seem to work. But the series does a good job of doing that. Even the comic books, and I've read a few of them where they explain that the quickening, that immortals cease to age only after they've taken their first head. So there's this feeling also like that maybe that's something, dealing more with the vampirism about it. Like when you get bit, that's when you stop aging. And in like Interview with a Vampire, I think it's Kirsten Dunst's character, who's basically a young girl. And then she has to deal with all of that, the fact that she will forever be seen as a young girl.
Yeah.
And in the comics, the idea that I think it's that death and reanimation is what actually causes them to kind of like stop aging and become immortal, so that they don't grow old and die. So I think there's different media have done that in Highlander, the TV series, good and bad, the comics, even in the subsequent sequels where Mario Van Peebles' character seems to have like changeling type powers, and he can use kind of like a magic. It's not a very good kind of magic, but it's a kind of magic. But it just keeps getting further and further away from everything they set up in this movie.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the kind of the stipulation of having to do the decapitation to cease aging, because one of the things that I was thinking of again was, and it's not explained, but the whole idea of there can only be one. Was there ever an immortal that was kind of like, well, I don't believe in this. Why can't we live in harmony in some way? Like, why do I have to decapitate, all these other people when why can't we just go on living our lives? So like, that's not explored, but I would imagine at some point, and maybe this was explored in
I feel like that wasn't that explored in the series, Michelle? Maybe that was.
It
right?
was.
Yeah.
In the first season, we have Darius, who is the monk, and he actually spends all of his time on sacred ground. And so, he comes to be very respected because he is kind of the Switzerland. Obviously, he's very good friends with Duncan. So he tends to be more towards the good. And he unfortunately is killed off by a secret society. But there's definitely even Duncan. I think he says in either, that might have been season 2, maybe it was season 1, where he talked about that he just got tired of it, got tired of everything, and he went off and he had spent time with a Native American group through part of his life, and so he went and lived on holy ground for the Native Americans, and so no one could touch him. So he stayed there for many, many years, and he comes out. Connor McLeod comes and talks to him, and they come off that land. But yeah, I mean, I would have thought that it would have been very interesting. Obviously, they wouldn't do it in the movie, but to have an immortal say, "No, I'm not leaving. I'm staying here. We're not going to have the quickening because I'm not leaving this hill."
and that would be an interesting juxtaposition, because you'd have someone who's part of the game but is not playing the game. But by the same rules, they're playing by the rules of the game. Like, I know I'm supposed to, cut ahead or give you my head, but I'm also going to just like stay in this corner on holy ground where you can't do this. So in a way, I'm never going to let you guys advance, which sometimes that would almost feel, going back to what you said earlier, Michelle, if there's some sort of spidey sense or immortal sense where the Kurgan sensed Connor was gone and that Ramirez was just there with Heather, and to keep things fair, I'll wait till Connor's out doing the harvest or doing something, and then I'll face Ramirez one-on-one. That feels like a good sport. That feels like you're honoring the rules, versus someone who would just say, well, I'm just going to stay on holy ground, like you did, Michelle. Cross your arms, nana, nana, nana. You're not getting in here. Be like, well, all right, well then how does this work? Because you're not honoring the maybe unspoken, or who knows, spoken rules that we have.
Yeah, so there's like some elements of John Wick going on there too, right? With the Continental, like everyone goes to the Continental, you can't exercise a hit while you're on those grounds.
That's very true.
I think in season 2 that you mentioned a secret society, Michelle, they get into the Watchers, which is an interesting layer, probably one of the better additions to the mythology, where you have basically mortals who've been watching, and some specifically people who have been assigned to watch immortals and track their movements, so that way they know where these immortals are, and they're basically keeping tabs of where Connor is, where these other immortals are. So as they take one off the board, so they're the back end, Pete, to your badge system, where they're like, yep, this one's person gone. But they also start going into the fact that maybe they're not Switzerland, like you mentioned, Michelle. Maybe there's an agenda there. Wouldn't you want someone who might be more beneficial to humanity to win the prize. So wouldn't you steer certain immortals to fight each other, so that way maybe you get someone who's weak off the board, and then you just keep working towards it. Those are interesting layers to the Highlander mythology that make it interesting versus some of the movies that, well, they just don't.
Yeah. Something that we touched on earlier was technology. And I think, Pete, you said, well, we didn't have internet, and I thought that was actually really interesting. And that kind of, ties in with Brenda having to go to the library and, sit in a very cold room while the computer expert went through and did the handwriting analysis. But, she goes off to look at birth certificates and things like that, and it's kind of like, yeah, I guess you would have done that back then, genealogy wise, because you wouldn't have been able to just type in, oh, let's look up Russell Nash and how long has he been, an antiques dealer. I don't think you could be in that kind of, I don't think you could be visible, but invisible in the technology that we have today. Versus what they had in the 1980s and the way that the story is told, the narrative. Even with the series with Duncan MacLeod, computers are becoming more pervasive in that world. But still, how would the watchers necessarily know who is immortal? I mean, were you following everybody? And then, wherever you heard there was a beheading, then you'd start like poking around and trying to figure it out because you wouldn't know. Now, I think Duncan MacLeod went by Duncan MacLeod a lot of the time. So it's kind of like, yeah, I'm proud of James Bond. I'm going to be James Bond. Even they know who I am. I'm not going to try and hide it. Versus, where you have Connor MacLeod who went through and hid his identity over the years. So it is interesting. I like The Watchers. It's an interesting story, but there is a little bit of gap there, how they were able to figure out who the immortals were and then follow them. And then the issue of measuring who's good, who's bad. And I like what you brought up, Bernie, is the fact that, well, looking at the board, you'd want to get the Kurgan off there earlier than later and not have him, there towards the end. But you had so many problems with the Watchers, and that's for another episode, but it's an interesting group, and it did bring an interesting twist to the mythology.
And I think you'll get this reference, Michelle. At least the immortals aren't aliens, right?
Exactly.
Plus, I don't know if the Watchers had subscription to the New York Post, but if they did in this movie, again, you mentioned this earlier, Michelle, like the bits of humor in this, where you keep having like these headlines of the New York Post. It was like one was like Headhunter 3, NYPD 0 or something like that. So I was like, I was enjoying some of those humorous touches that kept dotting the movie from different points.
I think what was interesting about that was, and something that I hadn't noticed, and I think I wrote it in my blog for the 36th anniversary, and that is the fact that how critical the movie is about the police system. And, obviously this is not the first time where we have ineffectual police departments. I mean, we had it in Terminator. And of course we have it here. They're, ineffectual, they're incompetent. That's what's reported in the Post. And you even get the stereotypical the cop bumbling through the crime scene right at the beginning. I think he steps into Facile's, blood or bones or whatever. And then another one who says, hey, can you get me a cherry Danish, to later where they're sitting reading the newspaper, they're drinking coffee. You can almost smell the staleness of the air in the scene. Feet are up on the desk. And I hadn't thought about the fact of how critical it was towards the police. And, I was thinking about to the cycle of films and how we had vigilante films in the late 70s. We had Death Wish, and then, we come into the 80s, and here you have like a fresh crop of movies where now you have these people charging into the police station, and basically just showing see, we don't have a good, enforcement system. We can't be a better group because here you have these people, other humans that are supposed to, protect and to serve, and they're not doing that. And I thought it was a really interesting commentary in this movie. It was definitely a more harsh one, and one that I wasn't expecting. And there was a lot of humor at the expense of police in this film.
They're also working in this like New York landscape that, and I forget the name of the mayor at the time, but it's like Streets of Fire, the Warriors era New York, where it feels like every subway train has graffiti on it, every street has rain on it. You have Michael Mannish neon lights everywhere because that's the aesthetic of it. So we live in a New York where there could be a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and yet like that would be completely understandable. Like that was Tuesday, or you could have beheadings. That's the world that we're living in, where like the city is so cynical about the police that as a like a filmmaker, you're like, this is actually the most realistic comment I'm going to make, is being somewhat critical about the police, because if people can get the whole immortal beheading thing out of the way, like that's harder to believe than Headhunter 3 Cop Zero.
Yeah, I mean, and this was definitely pre-Giuliani cleaning up New York. I mean, certainly in the 70s. I mean, I grew up on Long Island, so I would take the train into New York quite a bit. And when I was older, you still, in the 80s, it was still very much like, keep your head on a swivel. You're a suburban, white kid, just be careful. And, I think this was around the time that Bernie Getz on the New York subway had, there was like the whole vigilantism because he had shot a couple of kids that were attempting to hold him up. New York was still very much a dangerous place in a lot of regards. And so I think that, that commentary seems to be very much of its time. I think it was starting to turn by the mid 80s, but, there was still a lot of, bad areas, and, and there's a lot of poverty and crime. And, New York had yet to transform itself into what it's become, which, is a lot more sanitized now, and you can argue the merits of that, good or bad. But I don't want to get into a whole sociological conversation about New York City. But I mean, I love it, having grown up, right outside the city, for most of my life. But yeah, I think for sure the commentary in this film is very much of its time, of what New York represented to a lot of people in terms of safety and and culture.
I also think that it was probably maybe the easiest commentary, because of course in the mid 80s, this is 80, 85, 86 that the film was being shot, and then out in 86 we had all these different wars, because Reagan was in office. We had the war on drugs, we had the space wars, we had the Cold War, we had this new disease that was being transmitted, and we really didn't understand it, and people were dying from it, the whole AIDS. We had the punk rock scene, we have the rock scene, just the pervasiveness of music, and in the fiber. I grew up without MTV. I had to stay up really late to watch Friday Night Video on NBC. I think I had to try and stay up until like 1, 2 o'clock in the morning after the late night shows were over, just to try to watch some of this new thing called music videos. And so, it was a very interesting time. And I hadn't put together, kind of segueing over to the way some of the film was shot, that Mulcahy was very much into doing all the music videos. But I think that freshness that he brought in the way that he shot things, the fact that I think his second and third unit, I think it might have been his third unit, I think Tony Mitchell, who did some of the shots in actually New York City, was also a music video director. And so you got consistency of look, which I also think really helps this film. That you didn't have a conflict of directorial voice going on. So you have a very cohesive voice and vision, one vision going on with this film. So,
and some gorgeous shots in this movie. I mean,
mhm.
obviously when you've got locations such as Scotland and the Highlands there, I mean, that's the landscape is gorgeous, but still the framing involved. And I think there were like 2 or 3 different units that were involved in the filming of this. But I mean, just some really great composition shots. And again, I think going back, speaking to the music video aspect, it was still a very new medium at that point, because I can't remember exactly when MTV launched, but you're talking, this was filmed in 85. So you're talking about within 3-4 years of just music videos really being an actual medium. So I can totally see someone with that background bringing, an absolutely fresh perspective as opposed to someone that had been doing music videos throughout the 90s or something like that, where it had been a more established medium. This was still something very new and very fresh, and to have that appear in a feature film, I think lends an excitement to it that, might have been diluted had we been further removed from the launch of MTV and music videos.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Pete, because I was thinking back to when the Kurgan is driving Brenda over the bridge, and that could have been just kind of a nice, transition shot. But the way that Mulcahy actually shot it looks like a music video. The fact that he was able to go from a music video and kind of by the seat of his pants come up with an idea and shoot something that's only like 3-4 minutes long and be able to convey some sort of cohesive narrative, you have to be very, very smart with your shots. And I think I would have to say that Highlander and his ability to include very smart shots that really give you a lot of the story in a very quick bite that we're now very used to, but at that time was very new. But I still think it keeps the movie fresh even now.
I was going to say, by way of getting closer to wrapping up, and I'm just surprised at this point, this far into the conversation, we have not talked about the music of the movie, because I think it's hard to not talk about Highlander without talking about Queen. And the little bit of research I did, again, not trying to be a Wikipedia reference, but I guess they had just having at least a frame of reference. Queen had done the soundtrack for Flash Gordon just a year before, a movie that I very much love. Pete, I know your dad has very strong opinions about Flash Gordon.
I think it was a few years, because Flash Gordon was 1980.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. So it had been a few years.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess they saw the band, a rough cut of Highlander, and instead of doing the one song, they wanted to do the whole soundtrack. And it also read that each of the band members had favorite moments, and they went to kind of write the lyrics, compose what those songs would become. A Kind of Magic was the first CD I ever bought. If there was an official Highlander soundtrack, I probably would have bought that. But in lieu of that, I bought the closest thing, which was A Kind of Magic. Russell Mulcahy's music video origins, even the Kurgan's Def Leppard reference, and knowing that maybe Def Leppard or Duran Duran could have done the soundtrack for this movie, we got to talk about Queen.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Love Queen. I also have the album. I can remember seeing the movie and trying to just falling in love with the music. And even today, rewatching it last night, just all those musical cues were perfect. As much as I love Duran Duran and a lot of other 80s bands, I can't see anyone else putting the music out there and matching up with Highlander. It had to be Queen. I really do. And if it's an alternate world, and maybe it's something else, but the fact is that we have Queen, and it fit perfectly. I did go back and I watched Highlander 2, and there was a couple of references to Queen music in there, but a lot more of it was incidental. And we do have incidental music in Highlander. Michael Kamen is involved, so he really developed the nice classical, more musical score for the film. But yeah, it's really sad that we don't have an official release, and we still don't 36 years later. And I think Brian May talked about that it was something that he wanted to do, and it just hasn't happened. Um, there is a song, so I'll quiz you guys since you put me on the hot seat. There is a song that was in Highlander that was not on the album, and it has not been released. Do you know what it is?
Was that the New York, New York?
It is.
I don't think there's ever actually been an official release of that. We only have ever heard that snippet by, of Freddie Mercury singing, but never the full version.
Well, didn't Freddie Mercury was not a fan of that song, I believe, and I don't know if that's why it hasn't manifested itself in physical form anywhere.
I think it's a good take. I actually enjoyed it in the film, and of course, we have "Hammer to Fall" that plays on the radio. That was actually from an album before for Queen. It's a darn shame, because every song on the album really does, it cues right in. And if there's any sort of resonance that we see, MacLeod having as he has different experiences, music is probably the most easiest way to bring people into a sense of nostalgia. And Queen's album, A Kind of Magic, really does that. Has the funkiest cover. You would never know that this is the Highlander music, but
all those effects are in the music video too, which are directed by Russell Mulcahy as well. It's kind of like these suit wearing like cartoon characters. It's very interesting, very much not fitting of the tone of the movie, let alone like what it would be. It's interesting when I think about the soundtrack now, because I love Queen as well, but I think it's because of those songs that added some depth to the movie, which sounds kind of weird to say, but it's a kind of magic almost allows us to kind of dismiss everything else. We don't have to, we know that there's rules, but we don't have to know everything. Why? Because it's kind of magic. Like it's okay that we don't know how everything is supposed to work. It just works. And then even in Princes of the Universe, which has a lot of bravado, like I am immortal, I have inside me blood of kings, I have no rival, I literally could do this all day. No man can be my equal. Like there's a lot of stuff there, but at the same time, there's a lot of sentimentality there about love and loss. And I think some of that you get in the Michael Kamen score because there's sadness in it, in like the moments of piano. But then just to hit you, you do get those like Freddie Mercury vocals that are like, yeah, we're going to do a rock ballad now, but also you kind of know what this character has been going through. So to call him a Prince of the Universe, it's like, yeah, like these guys are, these immortals are princes of the universe. Like so far that maybe that's where they got the cue to make them aliens. Sorry, Pete, that may be a spoiler alert. But the fact that they even entertained that, but it's like there's enough there that you don't see that in, like, I don't remember, the Kroll. Well, I don't know. Nick did talk about playing D&D to the Kroll soundtrack, I think. But there's not a lot of movies of that era that just have that a soundtrack that's so engraved with the movie. Like you can't separate them. If you were to watch Highlander without Queen, I don't think it's Highlander.
Yeah.
Well, there was is the title something like "Want to Live Forever" or "Do You Want to Live Forever?"
Who Wants to Live Forever? Sure.
Who Wants to Live Forever? Yes. I mean, when that music cue hits and it gives you a little bit of the misdirection because MacLeod returns home and he's calling out for Heather. I mean, that just emotionally hit me, and then it turns out that it's years later and she's grown old, like just all very effective, wrapped up into those scenes right there. But again, like, there's such a resonance and a power to music is just hitting. And I thought that a lot of the songs just hit perfectly. I, again, having not seen this in so long, completely forgot that Queen did the soundtrack to this. So as it opens up, I'm like, is that Queen? I'm like, oh my God, it is. I'm like, it's like my mind's being blown here because I immediately went to, this is the type of movie that would have a soundtrack by Tangerine Dream or Marillion. And it sounds like Marillion was approached to do the soundtrack initially, to the point where I think a couple of the band members grew their hair because they were promised to be extras in the Scottish Highlands battle scene. And I think they were kind of regretting the fact that I remember if I read that they were on tour or something like that, so the timing didn't work out. But then Queen gets involved. I think Duran Duran could have, I mean, obviously very much more pop, but I mean they do have the ability to do ethereal, moody instrumentals. But I think, again, to your point, Michelle, the fantasy element of this just lends itself to Queen being able to pull that off a bit more than I think Duran Duran probably would have gone a little bit more of a poppy direction, and then you're going to have a very different movie. Just thinking of different bands that could have been involved in this instead of Queen. So yeah, again, I agree. I think, Queen ultimately just being the perfect choice, and it sounds like the members of the band were so taken with the movie that creates a bit of a kismet, because they're now heavily invested in making music that's going to really resonate, with what you're seeing on screen.
And I think of that scene, Pete, because I imagine when Connor's seeing Heather, right? And if I'm just putting myself in the shoes of those band members. You think about immortality, you only think of the benefits, the pros of being able to outlive anyone, not get sick, maybe accumulate wealth. Like you've hit the lottery, like you're going to be fine. But that Queen, who whichever one of them wrote that song, is like, yeah, but who would want to live forever? You're going to have so much loss and pain. Like, wouldn't actually it be easier not to go through all that? It's like, as much as you have the bravado in Princes of the Universe, you have the other side of the coin to say this isn't all it's supposed to be. Maybe it's not, and we were going to show you in this scene. So I was as I was watching the scene, I was trying to take out the song, but you can't. But I'm just imagining seeing it as a band member for the first time. It's interesting that was their takeaway, and not knowing nearly as much about music as you do, Pete. I would just imagine it's probably the easiest way to go is to go 80s rock ballad, like get into that gear instead of maybe seeing a little bit of depth in the scene and what they were going for, and lean into that and say, all right, we're going to try to also illustrate that in the soundtrack.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, so I peeked at Wikipedia. So Brian May is the one that wrote Who Wants to Live Forever? And what I find really interesting, he also wrote Give Me the Prize, Kerrigan's theme. So it's kind of interesting. You've got both sides of the coin, and it's interesting Brian May wrote both of those particular songs, and they are sequential to each other on the album. So
such a perfect theme for Kurgan too. It just feels so like he's brazen. Like, I'm going to he's not going to be dishonorable, but give me the prize. Like, I'm going to earn it. I'm going to fight my way through it. That's who I am.
Yeah.
If Connor is a prince, then Kurgan is a king of his own making.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't Kurgan, isn't his alias in New York Victor?
Victor.
Oh.
Projecting I will be victorious. I thought that was an interesting touch as well.
And he's also referred to as the Black Knight. When McLeod and Ramirez talks about him, he's referred to as the Black Knight. And it's interesting. I believe, if I remember correctly, Black Knight was his original name in the screenplay by Wyden. So it's interesting it actually made it into the film as well. Yeah, I think about Duran Duran, and until I think it's Ordinary Day came out, I would have always thought that Duran Duran, very poppy, very fun, would never have seen them as having that kind of complexity until that song, or maybe it's Ordinary World. That's the name of it. Yeah, and then I saw kind of like, oh, there's another side. I had nothing wrong with Duran Duran or any of their music, but when I heard that song always resonates for me, and I always think it's like one of their best ones. And it makes sense with A Kind of Magic, because it's a good journey album. I love to listen to music in their completeness. That means listening to the album from song A all the way to the end. And that means, going through, slushing through the middle. Sometimes you've got a clinker in there, but in this particular one, everything works, and it's the right type of pacing. that allows you to have the nostalgia of the film and immediately be able to replay in your mind, because it is such a visual film, to then be able to see it as you're listening to the music.
I'll music nerd out a little bit here, because I'm a huge Duran Duran fan myself, and the reason that I think they could have pulled it off is, even when you go to their earlier stuff, especially their earlier stuff in the early '80s. I mean, everyone knows "Hungry Like the Wolf" and "Rio" and the very poppy stuff, but I mean, you go to their B-sides and you listen to songs like "Tel Aviv" and the chauffeur. There's a depth to the music there that I think could have worked. It would still be a different movie from what Queen had done, but I definitely think that they could have pulled it off. But it's another one of those what if scenarios that are it's kind of fun to talk about when you hear of bands and Bernie, what you were talking about earlier, like some of the actors and actresses that could have been involved in this movie. Like the list is crazy. The people that, what kind of movie would it have been had, Kurt Russell had done this instead of Big Trouble in Little China? That's kind of crazy to think.
Would Christopher Lambert be in Big Trouble in Little China? And would that have worked? I don't know. Well, I'll say to kind of end where we began, you mentioned it on your blog, Michele, 36th anniversary, kind of an off year to celebrate the anniversary, but all things being equal, I will happily celebrate Highlander any year. So I don't need an excuse for that. I'm interested, maybe is this kind of like, as we kind of wind up the conversation, Michele, we've had almost a 2-hour discussion about this 1986 film. And I think, and Pete, I think you'd agree on this. We pride ourselves on, not necessarily being Wikipedia entries and regurgitating things you can find easily online, but trying to have conversations with like-minded fans about things, music, comics, movies, TV shows that might have had an impact on them, but then kind of digging into why. What's left the legacy? Why is it that something like a 1986 movie about a bunch of immortals beheading themselves, why is it that we're talking about this film like it's Casablanca or Citizen Kane or something that AFI might have recognized as a film to be in a vault somewhere with 100 other films? But this movie, for me, it was a movie that, again, like a lot of those 80s films, it stands on its own because it feels different. The music, the cast, the direction, everything about it. And now the more academic viewpoint that you're pursuing with it, Michele. So what is it like? What would your ultimate goal be for this collection? Like what are you looking for? What perspectives are you looking for? Because now with hindsight, with time, and with different perspectives, you can look at it from a pop approach, from a scholarly approach, and all of those things would hold water just as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking for as many perspectives that I can. I know that one of the reasons that I chose to pursue this as my next edited collection, because I had quite a few in my corkboard of ones that I was interested in doing. But what kind of cued me in on this is, one, the fact that it's a film that I'm passionate about. I really believe in. Like you said, Bernie, it clicks. It brought every component together. And even though it's not Lord of the Rings, where they spent 3 years filming back to back, this is no less an important film as those were, because I feel like there's a magic about it. The storytelling, everything comes together. It's very cohesive. At the same time, it kicked off a very interesting franchise, because you moved into a series of sequel films. As good and as bad as they are still part of what defines this franchise. You've got television shows that spent many, many years going through, looking at that mythology, looking to create and understand. At the same time that it is creating new meaning to it, it's also kind of defining it and reinventing itself, keeping it going, evolving with the times. You've got so many books. You've got, like you were mentioning, there's the comics. There's the music, whether it's Queen, Michael Kamen, or any of the other type of music that came after, particularly in the television series. There's a lot of music associated with the television series, and you can get those. To the video games, there's a lot to unpack with this franchise. My biggest thing for doing this is the fact that when you look back at everything that's been talked about this franchise, there isn't a cohesive book that tried to mediate all these different narratives into one cohesive conversation. There's lots of film reviews, film discussions. Obviously, we've got a book on the first film because that is the seminal, the cornerstone, foundational stone for this franchise. But beyond some of those things of talking about the films, the music, lots on the music actually, and the idea of Scotland as a character in this first film. Many years before we had Outlander, I actually went back and looked and saw that the original novel for Outlander was released in 1990. And I couldn't find anything saying that Highlander was influential, but there's definitely connections there that you could make arguments there. But this is such a fascinating franchise to take a look at and to really bring that dialogue out into the public and kind of take it out of what we're seeing on the internet and putting it into a book form that more people can take a look at. My hope is that it's a as fascinating journey as we've had here today, but also the journey and the interest that we have of this film from 36 years ago. Obviously, this is an academic book, but I don't want people to be scared off by that. I am really seeking to include essays that are armchair enthusiasts. Yes, you'll have endnotes. You'll have to cite sources, but this is such an entertaining and such an interesting franchise that has a lot of themes that should matter to us. So it's important to me that, yes, we talk about it in an academic way, but we not forget that there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of passion, and I don't want that to be lost in this book. And that's my hope, and that is my driving vision. That this will be a book that can kind of fill that gap, that we come to a dialogue that, like Connor McLeod at the end, where he can hear all the voices, that we'll have a book that we can hear a lot of those voices and be able to mediate them and come to understand even more what Highlander means in our pop culture.
Damn, Michelle, that was really good. Pete, any last words that you want to throw in there?
No, I mean, this was a joy to talk about. I was really pleased to be able to delve into this one a bit more. Again, this was almost like a first watch for me, again, after having not seen it for so long. So I came away from it with my brain just kind of making all these different calculations of like, well, we can talk about this and this and this. So I'm really just thrilled, Michelle, that you were on and willing to talk to us about Highlander. This has been great. If anyone happens to be listening and would be interested in submitting to an essay for your book, what's the best way that they can go about doing that?
So the first thing is that I do have the call for papers on my website. So it's michellebrittany.com, Michelle with one L, Brittany with two T's, A-N-Y. I do have the call there, and it'll give you all the details. I actually talk about why this is an important thing, why this book's important, what the gap is. I provide a very long list of things that I'm interested in. I hope that I've touched on everything. What I didn't touch on earlier, I'm also looking at fan fiction. Obviously, there's a lot of fan fiction out there, and I think that needs to also be discussed. So I'm actually hoping people that are into fan studies will want to also submit. I'm looking for an abstract, a very brief bio and just kind of an idea of like what sources you'd want to look at as the way to discuss and bring Highlander into that larger scholarship conversation. Pretty laid back. I'm very, I want to work with people. So it's, please don't be afraid. Ask questions. Take a look at the CFP on my website. And then, of course, feel free to email me. I'm at mcbrittany@gmail.com. If you have any questions, I would love to talk about Highlander. I can't believe how quickly 2 hours went. You have both been wonderful to talk about Highlander, and I hope that we get to talk about Highlander again sometime, maybe the series. We'll ignore the sequels, but maybe get into the into the series, maybe the first season, and talk about some of the themes, how they get fleshed out in the series. But definitely hope that people will want to submit. The deadline is May 31st. I have kind of a tight schedule. I do have a publisher that I'm working with. I've already got the deal, so it's not submitting and then wondering whether it'll ever get published. So I'm already ahead of the game there. I also have some connections. I'm actually hoping that I'll be able to get maybe some of the people that have been involved in Highlander to do the intro and the or the forward and the afterward. Just some of those higher names. So if you're wanting to be attached,
is it Brenda,
with
Michelle? Is it Brenda?
Huh?
Is it Brenda?
I wish, but maybe think a little higher.
Okay.
So, but I will be trying for some higher names to be attached with this. So I've got some networking that I'm working on. So I'm definitely hoping that people will take an interest, go back and take a look at Highlander, and then please take a look at my call.